I think this is an important conversation, and I'm so glad that we have Max here with us to start the conversation. I'd like to hear a little bit, Max, about why you decided to write this book now. You've talked about how the day after the election you changed your voter registration from Republican to independent, and it marked a definite shift in your mind. But in the meantime, several years have passed. You've had time to think about the implications of the election. Why now?
Well, that's a good question. First, let me just say thank you to the Pacific Council for hosting this event and for all of you for coming out. Thanks to Jana for engaging in this conversation with me. And, you know, truth in advertising, this book was actually not my idea. I really just do whatever my editor tells me. And that's Bob Weil at Norton, who is a tremendous editor, and this is my third book with him. And the idea for this book actually came up earlier in the year, which is blindingly fast in the stodgy world of publishing. This was actually while I was doing a book tour for my previous book, which came out in January, which was a biography of the legendary covert operative, Edward Lansdale. And, you know, I was doing the book tour, but I was also writing a lot about Trump and what's going on with the Trump administration, as I have been doing from day one. And as I was on the book tour, Bob called me up and said, hey, I have a great idea, which is, you know, why don't you do a book summing up a lot of the things that you're saying in your columns about Donald Trump? And as I often am, I was initially resistant before I was won over to the superiority of Bob's ideas. And, you know, he convinced me that this was something worth doing. And as I thought about how to do it and how to add some value beyond simply what I was saying in my columns, I decided to do a more memoiristic or autobiographical approach, really trying to write as honestly as I could about the Trump phenomenon and what it meant to me personally. And that wound up taking me into territory I have not previously covered in print, writing about how I became an American when I came here in 1976 with my mother and grandmother. And when I say here, I mean literally here to Los Angeles. I mean, I grew up in Encino in the San Fernando Valley. And, you know, how I became a conservative in the 1980s here in what used to be known as Reagan country. And, you know, how I became a conservative troublemaker at UC Berkeley, where I was a columnist for the Daily Californian in 1990, 1991, and then eventually rising up the slippery pole of conservative journalism and as op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal, and then writing for many years for places like Commentary and the Weekly Standard, and, you know, working on these Republican presidential campaigns. And so, you know, writing about all of that to make people understand why I'm so shocked and horrified by the rise of Donald Trump, who really seems in opposition to everything that I had naively imagined that conservatism was about.
Talk to us a little bit about what was so appealing to you about conservatism when you were growing up here as an immigrant in the 1980s. What was the first draw?
Well, I would say the first draw, you know, coming from a communist country like a lot of other communist refugees, whether from Vietnam or Cuba or what have you, was the fact that the Republican Party was anti-communist. It was the more anti-communist party. And I, you know, growing up as a kid here in the 1980s, I really thrilled to Ronald Reagan's defense of democracy, of human rights, of American values, and standing up to the evil empire, as he called it, and saying, you know, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I love that kind of moral clarity that he expressed. And then, you know, as part of becoming a conservative and a Republican, you know, I went through, you know, I kind of bought the whole package. It wasn't just anti-communism. I mean, as I write about in the book, you know, one of the seminal events in my life came about when I was, you know, 13 years old, and my father got me a subscription to National Review, and, you know, I became an avid reader of National Review when I was a kid, and I was
like most kids.
Yeah, like most kids, exactly. Well, I was just about to say, to to indicate what kind of uber nerd I was, while, normal kids had, in my day probably had, posters of Farrah Fawcett or somebody in their, in their bedroom. I had a portrait of Winston Churchill. So cards on the table. This is an embarrassing admission on my part, but that's who I was. And so I kind of thrilled to the conservative agenda. And truthfully, I've always also been kind of a troublemaker and a maverick and a rebel. So I kind of liked being the conservative troublemaker at my very liberal high school, which was the Cleveland Humanities Magnet in Reseda, California, and then of course at Berkeley, where I would write these kind of standard issue conservative columns. And I remember reveling in the reaction, including one time I literally got a bullet in the mail with my name on it. I mean, my name was actually taped on the bullet. The Daily Cal got a brick through the window, and that I frankly enjoyed getting a rise out of people, and that kind of fed my sense that the other side couldn't make good arguments. They had to resort to these kinds of bullying tactics. And so I was all in writing about political correctness and kind of the whole gamut of conservative issues in the late 80s, early 1990s. And that kind of set me on the course to eventually becoming a part of the conservative movement in the Republican Party.
How much do you feel like being in Los Angeles as a child affected your worldview? It sounds like being in a liberal place kind of pointed you in the conservative direction a bit.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's another person I can think of who one could describe in similar fashion, and that would be Stephen Miller, who was a graduate of Santa Monica High School. But I want to stress here that my version of conservatism is a little different from his. And I'm not actually sure how a Jewish kid who went to Santa Monica High School could wind up as this kind of nativist nationalist, kind of a bizarre development. From my standpoint, I was embracing conservatism at a time when it was much more optimistic and open and inclusive than it is today. People forget that, Ronald Reagan was somebody who was pro-immigration. He actually gave a speech in 1980 in which he talked about making America great again. Familiar phrase, but he was celebrating the achievements of immigrants, speaking in front of a backdrop of the Statue of Liberty. He was not reviling immigrants as animals who breed and infest our cities and as rapists and murderers and gangsters and all this other kind of rhetoric that you hear from Donald Trump. It was inconceivable in those days. Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty bill in 1986 to legalize a large number of undocumented immigrants. He actually talked about his dream was to eliminate borders in North America between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The very charge that Trump always makes wrongly about Democrats, claiming they are for open borders, which is not in fact the case, but that was actually Ronald Reagan's dream. So that tells you how far the Republican Party has moved in the wrong direction from the time when I was a kid, and thrilling to Reagan's conservatism. And I would add one other thing, which is I think a lot of what attracted me to Ronald Reagan was also the fact that he was so transparently, a good guy. He was a gentleman. He was very soft-spoken. He was always courtly. He didn't attack his opponents in harsh words. He was really somebody, he could engage in some hard-edged rhetoric, but it was always at the level of policy or ideology. It wasn't directed at individuals. It's inconceivable that Ronald Reagan, would be demeaning people, especially, women or minorities. That's just not who he was.
It's true. When we think about American democracy and where we go from here, there's a lot that we could talk about tonight. And if you haven't read the book yet, you can get your copy outside and dive deeply into all the different foreign policy issues that he hits on. But one thing I thought we could talk about, staying on the Soviet front, is something you wrote about today, which is the INF Treaty. And so my question is, this is of course the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty from 1987 that Trump has just made a decision about, and you could talk a little bit about that. But my question is this, you argued in your piece today that the policy from your perspective is actually right, but the messaging has been wrong on so many other occasions that it puts the messaging about something that you would agree with in jeopardy. So as we think about American democracy from a foreign policy perspective, how do you navigate those waters in an example like that?
Well, I mean, to invoke the old cliche, I mean, I try to call them as I see them, and this is one of those rare occasions where Donald Trump has done something that I agree with. It doesn't happen very often, like, a stopped clock being right twice a day. And I think there is a good case to be made on the INF Treaty. This treaty signed in 1987 between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, which eliminated a whole class of land-based intermediate range missiles. Those are missiles with a range of between 310 and 3,400 miles, like the Pershing II and the Soviet SS-20, which was a great idea at the time and helped to stabilize Europe and to end the Cold War. But I think times have changed, and these days the Russians are cheating on the treaty. They're deploying a missile called the SSC-8, which is in violation of the INF limits, and China has never been bound by the treaty at all. And of course, since the 1980s, there has been the big story in the world since the 1980s is the rise of China to shortly become the largest economy in the world and a much more powerful military force in the Western Pacific and East Asia as well. And a lot of that has to do with their deployment of intermediate range missiles like the DF-26, which can target American aircraft carriers at sea, which can target US bases at Guam. And so I think it does make sense for the United States to counter the Chinese buildup with land-based intermediate range missiles of its own, but we're not legally allowed to do that under the limits of the INF Treaty. So which is why, I think it does make sense for the US to pull out of the INF Treaty. But the point I made in the article is it's very hard for the Trump administration to make a serious case on this issue because most of the time they are just motivated by inveterate, out-of-control hostility to all international institutions. And that is certainly, Donald Trump is a unilateralist. He's a nationalist, as he said this week. And John Bolton, his national security advisor, is all of that on steroids. And so, the Trump administration has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think was a catastrophic mistake, which undermines our ability to contain Chinese power. They pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. They pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal. They've stopped funding the UN Welfare and Relief Agency for Palestinian refugees. They pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council. For goodness sakes, they're even pulling out of the Universal Postal Convention, which has been around since the 1870s to govern the delivery of international mail. So the image that they project is that they are just hostile to the idea of international cooperation. And I think that pretty much every single one of those other decisions was a big mistake. Now on the INF Treaty, I think they have a good point, but they're basically, the boy who cried wolf. They can't see any international obligation which is worthwhile. And, finally they're right. This is an international obligation which is not worthwhile, but I think the lesson here for them is stop making these stupid arguments, because when you have a good case to make, people are not going to be listening.
You talk a lot in the book about and you're very candid about what you consider your own culpability in making the conservative case on some particular missteps, the war in Iraq being one. And you talk about after 9/11, how you wrote a piece for the Weekly Standard called "The Case for American Empire." What do you think, looking back at that, talking about all of these missteps on current treaties and such, what's the key, if you could wave your magic wand, what is the key to avoid some of these missteps, not for the Trump administration, but for any foreign policy official who is in the heat of an argument, doesn't have, how could we go through the process that you have now gone through and this catharsis in the moment? Is there something that through the process of writing the book you've learned that's given you perspective on how we could make different decisions in the moment rather than years later with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, it's very hard because it's very easy to get caught up in the moment. And, I think in hindsight, I and a lot of other people were very influenced by the two major events of my young adult and not so young adult years, which were A, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and B, 9/11. So obviously those are the major foreign policy events and indeed the major events period, two of the major events period of the last, 40 years or more. From 9/11, I think really from 11/9, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think I and a lot of other people, for example, Frank Fukuyama, now at Stanford, drew a lesson that, this was the triumph of liberal democracy and that the entire world was destined to essentially have the same kind of government as we do, and that this was the end of this ideological competition, and that we had won, our system of government had won. And in fact, if you read Frank's book, The End of History, you'll see that he actually wrote that the big challenge in the future is going to be dealing with our boredom as we all become these wealthy, liberal democracies. And whatever else you may say about the present moment, we are certainly not bored. But so there was that sense. I think there was an American triumphalism and a hubris that was also fed by the unexpectedly easy American success in the Gulf War. And so we were left as the lone superpower striding atop the world. And then, of course, 9/11 came along. It was a devastating blow, the worst foreign attack ever on American soil. And so obviously we wanted to strike back. And I think there was unanimity on striking back in the case of Afghanistan. And then things became a little bit more complicated in the case of Iraq. But, in this book, I really rethink my support for the Iraq War for the first time and admit it was a mistake. But, if you think back in terms of if I think back in terms of my mentality and the mentality of other people, well, I mean, in the first place, I wouldn't have supported the invasion of Iraq if it hadn't been for the conviction that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which I don't think was a lie necessarily on the part of the Bush administration. It was just an erroneous intelligence judgment that was reached by our intelligence community, but as well as by intelligence agencies all around the world. But after this judgment that there were the weapons of mass destruction, there was also a kind of naive expectation that I think was fed by certain scholars of the Middle East, folks like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami and others, that somehow we could not only invade and occupy Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein, but having done that, we could implant a liberal democracy, because there was a sense that this is where history was headed anyway, and it was going to be, people wanted to have a liberal democracy, and it wasn't going to be that hard. And I think I kind of fell prey to that hubristic judgment, in part because, our experience at that point had been seeing the nations of Eastern Europe transform from communist dictatorships to liberal democracies. And so there was this assumption that it wouldn't be that hard to do this elsewhere. Of course, if we'd waited a few years, we would have seen the backsliding in places like Hungary and Poland, where they are actually moving back from liberal democracy. And that's a reminder of how hard it is to actually implant a durable liberal democracy. So, I think there were a lot of assumptions at the time. I don't think I was unique in this. I think these were widely shared assumptions, but they proved to be tragically erroneous. And there were certainly people at the time who were wise enough to see through some of these foolhardy assumptions. I mean, I remember when I was the op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal in 2002, running an op-ed by Brent Scowcroft, where the headline was something like, "Don't overthrow Saddam Hussein," which caused a lot of heartburn in the White House, and which I and others did not agree with at the time. But in hindsight, I have to say, well, hats off to General Scowcroft, because I think he was a wise old hand, and in retrospect, he was right. And I think, the subsequent experience has led me to be very wary of preventative conflicts. It's certainly alerted me, as I should have been alerted in the past, to the limits of American power, and to have greater appreciation for the kind of prudence displayed by a Brent Scowcroft, by George H.W. Bush, or by President Eisenhower, who is now has risen greatly in my estimation as a true model for what a president should be.
But that's also a shift, you write, right? Like, what did 30 years ago, how would you have described Eisenhower?
I was much more critical of Ike. I did not like Ike as much 30 years ago as I do now. I was impatient with him. I like a lot of kind of naive young people, I fumed that, he was not a brilliant military strategist. He made mistakes. He allowed the Wehrmacht to escape from Normandy and to continue to fight. He was cautious. He was not one of these great commanders in history like Napoleon or Frederick the Great or even a Patton or MacArthur perhaps. And I fumed with his presidency that he was very cautious. He didn't do enough to stand up to Joe McCarthy. He didn't do enough to push for desegregation and various other issues. But with the passage of time now that I'm a middle-aged geezer myself, I have come to appreciate the wisdom that Ike possessed, and it makes me really appreciate the fact, for example, how difficult his job in World War II actually was in doing alliance management, essentially diplomacy at the very highest level. I mean, I got a small glimpse in this as a sometime part-time advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq, seeing just how hard it is to actually hold an international coalition together. And I think General Petraeus actually has a lot of the same skill set that General Eisenhower had in his ability to do that and to get many nations to work together. No mean achievement. And I also, in hindsight, have vast appreciation for Ike's prudence in office as president, kind of steering a middle path, avoiding conflict, presiding over the peace and prosperity of the 1950s, avoiding the extremes of either side. I think that's actually a pretty good model to follow. And really with this shakeout in Republican politics that's occurred with the rise of Donald Trump, I've become kind of disenchanted with the entire conservative movement, of which I spent my entire life as a part of. And it's made me go back to the origins of the conservative movement in the 1950s when folks like Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater and Bill Buckley and others were starting the conservative movement. And it made me realize, wait a second, what were they rebelling against? Were they rebelling against some commie pinko in the White House? No, they were rebelling against Dwight D. Eisenhower because President Eisenhower was way too moderate for them. And in hindsight, I just don't understand that because I think, it makes me realize, I used to think of myself as kind of a Reagan conservative, and I still admire President Reagan, but in hindsight, I'm now realizing, well, I'm actually probably more like a Rockefeller Republican, or as I prefer to call it, an Eisenhower Republican, because I do think that Ike was a more accomplished and admirable figure than Nelson Rockefeller.
You also talk about some things about Eisenhower that I don't think most people necessarily think of offhand, like the fact that he sent troops to implement desegregation of schools.
Right.
And he's not necessarily known for those things, but that fits sort of the general ideology that I think you're espousing as well.
Right.
You talk about the shakedown.
And one of the things, one of the reasons why Eisenhower was so unpopular with conservatives was that he appointed Earl Warren, the former governor of California, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And of course, Justice Warren presided over Brown v. Board of Education.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the shakedown in Republican politics, and you had a chance to work closely with Senator McCain, who after his recent passing, we've heard lots of conversations about whether that's the end of an era for Republican politics, which you might argue it is. Tell us something that you learned from that experience of working with him and where he fell in your spectrum of conservative politics.
Well, I really revere John McCain. He's one of the few people in politics that I still revere. I mean, he was a great American, and one of the many things I can never forgive Donald Trump for is his comment in the summer of 2015 about how he doesn't think that John McCain was a hero because John McCain was captured. I mean, it's hard for me to even talk about that without choking up, considering that John McCain endured 5.5 years of captivity, brutal, hellish torture when he could have gotten out, but he refused to get out because he abided by the POW's code of first in, first out, and he would sooner risk death and in torture rather than sacrifice his honor, and that is a concept of honor that is utterly alien to Donald Trump. And you saw that concept of honor when McCain ran in 2008, and there was that famous moment where you had this proto-Trumpkin at a town hall asking him whether Barack Obama was a closet Arab or Muslim or whatever. And it would have been very easy for John McCain to agree with her and basically to feed the conspiracy theory in order to win support in the right. And instead of doing that, he said, no, ma'am, he's a good American just like you and me. We just happen to have a difference of opinion. And I really think there was that kind of moderation that prevented a lot of people on the right from embracing John McCain and contributed to his defeat. But that is really what made him a great man. And one other thing I would say about McCain, I mean, there are so many things one can say, and I was so deeply moved and touched attending his memorial service in Washington in August, where it really felt like a brief moment of bipartisan unity coming together to honor him. And it was truly electric with Meghan McCain's speech and everybody in the congregation singing America the Beautiful. I mean, really an elegy for a Republican Party that no longer exists. But one other thing I would cite about John McCain that really impressed me about him was, I had a chance to go with him to the Munich Security Conference on a few occasions on this, Air Force jet for the congressional delegation. And I remember just walking up to the front of the plane at one time and, seeing McCain sitting in his cabinet and, in his cabin, not cabinet, cabin. And, he was just sitting there reading this thick book of history. He loved to read history, which is actually how we met, by the way, because my first book of history, The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power, one of the chapters in there was about the U.S. pursuit of Pancho Villa during the World War I years. And it turned out that one of the officers who was fighting Pancho Villa was an ancestor of John McCain. So he was interested in that, and so that was how we were first introduced. But just seeing Senator McCain sitting there in the cabin and reading this thick book of history, and this was not for show. I mean, he just genuinely enjoyed sitting there reading history. And so you think, wow, can you imagine, like a president who actually enjoys reading books and is capable of reading a book? I mean, it's like an otherworldly experience these days.
You describe yourself now as a militant centrist, which I think you should trademark. And you talk about Macron as an example of centrism that works. Talk to us a little bit about Macron and that's so far removed from the American experience. Could he translate here? Could we get a centrist candidate here?
Well, it's a long shot. I mean, that may be wishful thinking on my part, but I do think there is widespread dissatisfaction with the two-party system. And because now I'm an independent, and independents are actually the largest party in America, about 42% of the electorate. Republicans are about 27%, Democrats about 29%. So most people are not part of either of the two parties, which dominate the landscape because of the structure of our government and our politics is set up basically to further this two-party duopoly. And so I feel like there's a lot of people like me who are essentially politically homeless. I'm somebody who is socially liberal, fiscally conservative, believe in American leadership, believe in free trade, believe in fiscal responsibility, believe that we need to do something about climate change. So I don't really feel like there's a party that speaks for me or for a lot of other people like me. And so this is maybe my wishful thinking, is to imagine that perhaps there could be a Macron-like figure who could arise here, just as he did in France, to run as a centrist and to kind of make centrism sexy, because there is so much, I think, dissatisfaction with the two-party system. I mean, I don't think it's impossible because, again, people don't like the two parties. There's a lot of people outside of them. And essentially, Donald Trump himself it's not like he's a lifetime loyal Republican. He's essentially an independent himself who took over and hijacked the Republican Party. And so it's not impossible to imagine you could have another moderate or centrist who maybe takes over the Democratic Party or runs as a third-party candidate. I mean, if the Democrats nominate, I think, somebody like an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, I think that does create a lot of running room for a centrist in 2020. And I think the potential is there. I mean, the question is, who could this person be? And I honestly don't know. I mean, what I say in the book is I imagine somebody who's kind of perhaps a slightly younger and slightly more charismatic Michael Bloomberg. Now, of course, Mayor Bloomberg himself is running, and I wish him all luck. I mean, he is somebody I'd love to see as president. I think he would be a superb president. The question is, can he win the actual election? You know, is he too conservative for the Democratic Party? Is there room for somebody like that, either as a Democrat or as a third-party candidate? I don't know, but it's a long shot, but I think the potential is there. I don't think you're going to build a third party from the grassroots up, but I think there is kind of a moonshot chance of building a third party from the top down. Essentially, if you could get a candidate who wins the presidency without the support of either party, and then, you know, starts to realign American politics. I think not likely, but not impossible.
Before we go to audience questions, I wanted to ask you one more question. You've had a lot of conversations now about the book, and you have had a number of different responses from people who are more left-leaning than you. And some say, welcome, glad that you can join us at the party. And others say, thanks for your acknowledgement, but it's not enough. Are you learning anything as you have these conversations about the book, about the state of American democracy and the citizenry and the place we're in, and if we're able to have these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I'm learning that we're screwed because we have a lot of extremists here on the left as well as the right. And there are a lot of people who are determined to preserve their ideological purity rather than getting things done. And I think that's kind of the sin that has been besetting American politics long before the rise of Donald Trump. It's almost impossible to pass, you know, bipartisan legislation in Washington because both sides are catering to their bases, to the primary voters, to the activists, to the extremists, and that's what's really leading us to the dysfunction that we see in Washington. You know, as you suggest, Jan, I've been exposed to a little bit of it. And it's not a universal phenomenon. I mean, I've had one of the heartening things, let me focus on the positive for a second. One of the heartening things about leaving the Republican Party and denouncing Donald Trump is that there have been an awful lot of folks on the left side of the spectrum who have been tremendously welcoming and wonderful. And I've struck up, you know, unlikely friendships and alliances with folks like David Corn and Mother Jones, which I would have certainly never expected to happen. I had a wonderful laudatory review in New York Magazine from Jonathan Chait, who is very much on the liberal side of the spectrum. So these you know, I'm you know, working on a policy paper now with a fellow at the Center for American Progress, the liberal think tank in Washington. So there has been some cross-partisan pollination which has been going on, which I think is incredibly important because I really feel like the differences between center right and center left really fade into insignificance when we have a real threat to our democracy that we have to deal with. But there are people certainly on the extremes who don't view it that way. And so, for example, you know, I had a writer in The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald's online publication, basically, you know, saying that, essentially, you know, saying I'm a war criminal and that I should not be allowed into polite society and, you know, I should become a ski instructor or something. Rather than opining on politics, which, by the way, is remarkably similar to what Tucker Carlson said to me from the other extreme about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I did the most vitriolic interview of all time with Tucker Carlson, where he told me that nobody respects me and that I should really go into selling insurance or painting houses instead of doing what I'm doing. And obviously, Tucker has a vastly exaggerated impression of my house painting or insurance selling skills. But very kind of funny to me that both The Intercept and Tucker Carlson are telling me to get out of the political punditry business. And, you know, in the case of the far left, basically, you know, the reason I'm a war criminal, the reason I should not be allowed into polite society is because I supported the Iraq War, which, oh, by the way, was supported by about 72% of the American population by bipartisan majorities of both houses, including those notorious neocon warmongers like Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, John Kerry, and many others. But, you know, somehow because I joined with them in supporting the war, I am now, you know, to be ostracized. So that to me is very self-defeating. I mean, that's something that will allow a certain subset of the progressive population to maintain their air of moral superiority, but it's not actually going to do anything to defeat Donald Trump. It's not going to do anything to take back American politics. And I think, we got to overcome these differences and try to work together for the common good.
Seems like a good jumping off point to take questions from the audience. I'm sure there are lots of interesting directions that we can take the conversation, and there are microphones in the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I'd like to alternate between questions from men and questions from women. So if we start with a man, a woman needs to get ready. Go ahead. Oh, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Arnie Fishman. I was listening to you as you spoke, and a thought came to me. You said you were in favor of, American leadership in the world. And over the years, I've talked to different people, and it seemed like every time we got around supporting somebody outside of America, we somehow believed that culturally they were going to be like us if they only could see who we were. And we never seemed to have a real idea of who they were culturally. And even your conversation about the notion of leadership sort of suggests that there is a right way, and it seems to maybe be extending into the public. There's the left and the right, each one thinking that they're the right way. I don't know where we got this idea that we really are the world leaders and everybody should be like us. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I've changed some of my views and I've changed my party affiliation, but I have not changed my belief that the world benefits from a strong America as a world leader. And that's something that there used to be a bipartisan consensus on that. Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright spoke very movingly about the need for American leadership in the 1990s. And, when I look at the world that we have built since 1945, this is the longest period of peace and prosperity, the greatest expansion of freedom and democracy in world history. And I think the most far-sighted decisions ever made by any American policymakers were those made by the Truman administration, which decided not to leave Europe and Asia after the conclusion of World War II, keeping American troops in places like Germany, Italy, Japan, and South Korea, providing Marshall Plan aid to the nations of Europe, including our former enemies, to transform them from enemies into allies, helping to midwife democracy in places like Japan and Germany. This is really the foundation of the American world order, and it was actually an act of enlightened altruism. I mean, can you imagine somebody like Donald Trump providing tens of billions of dollars of aid to allies and former enemies? He would think that we were being ripped off. Or can you imagine, Donald Trump pushing for a free trade system when we dominated the entire global economy, and we would have benefited from a lack of free trade. But in fact, folks like Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, George Marshall, and others were incredibly far-sighted in understanding that American success in the future would be greater if we could bring our allies and trading partners along with us, and that we could champion liberal democracy, we could champion this open, liberal, international world order. And that is something we have done pretty continuously since 1945, and I think it has been one of the glories of history in that time period. I think it is the foundation of our peace and prosperity. And Donald Trump is putting that at risk right now by trashing our allies, by praising dictators like Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, now Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, by eschewing the values that we stand for. Now, to be clear, I understand that we've often compromised our values. There were plenty of dictators that we supported for political expediency's sake during the Cold War because they were at least, from our perspective, non-communist dictators, and some of those decisions were right and some were wrong, but we also did some wonderful things, like, for example, getting the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn out to the world, by speaking up for dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, by helping the Solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s. And I think these were wonderful things that were tremendously beneficial, not only for the cause of human rights, but for American strategy and American security and prosperity understood in the broader sense. And I think if we step back from our leadership role in the world, as we seem to be doing right now, and I think this was happening even before Trump took power, but he is accelerating, I think, the decline of the American-led world order. I think it's going to be a catastrophe, because if America is not acting as the guarantor of this liberal international world order, who is going to pick up the slack from us? The answer is no one. You're either going to see a Chinese-dominated world order, which would be an authoritarian state that tries to export repression rather than freedom, or I think more likely you would see a multipolar, chaotic world order of the kind that you saw prior to 1914, with multiple centers of power, the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, and many others competing for influence, with arms races breaking out all over the place, strategic rivalry, the rise of illiberal movements, horrible crimes against humanity going unpunished. So I think this would not be a world in which we would want to live, but I think that is the world that we are headed, because Donald Trump is essentially vandalizing the bipartisan achievement of generations of American policymakers.
Yes.
Just to follow up on that statement, where do you think the outrage is? Why aren't we hearing from more of our leaders on the destruction of things that we have valued over the years of our history?
Well, I mean, I think you're certainly hearing some of it. I mean, the Democrats have made a choice, at least in this midterm election, that they are not going to run an anti-Trump campaign per se. They're really running a campaign on health care. And whether that is a wise decision or not, I just don't know. I guess we'll find out in a couple of weeks' time. David Brooks was pretty critical of that in the New York Times, saying that the Democrats are not really rising to the moment, to the challenge that we face to American democracy, and I would add to the American-led world order. They're not really speaking to that. They're trying to run on pocketbook issues, and in some sense, almost pretending that Donald Trump is a normal Republican, and they're going to run on kind of a normal Democratic campaign against the normal Republican. That could turn out to be a shrewd calculation. I don't know. I'm not a political strategist. We will find out in a couple of weeks. But I do think it is imperative to speak up for this global world order that we have underwritten, that we have championed, that we have led for all these generations. And I think part of the reason, I mean, Democrats are in a difficult position to do that because remember, I mean, President Obama was already starting to pull back a little bit under his presidency, and I think that was kind of a natural reaction to the post 9/11 world, to the Iraq War in particular, which I think soured a lot of Americans on foreign interventions. We are already, I mean, you already heard, talk about nation building begins at home even before Donald Trump took office, and I think, the reality is that folks like, I mean, I don't really know what an Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders foreign policy looks like, but I think that they are probably somewhat sympathetic to the idea of American retreat as well. They're certainly not free traders. I mean, you don't see a lot of people in the Democratic Party, sadly, speaking up for free trade, because there's a lot of Democrats who are sympathetic to protectionism. And of course, Republicans have normally been the constituency of free trade, but they have been silenced because they're afraid to speak up against Donald Trump. And so there is not much of a constituency anymore for free trade, which is probably the only thing that you can get 99.9% of economists, everybody except Peter Navarro, to agree that free trade is a good thing, but very few political leaders are speaking up for that. I think if there's a positive from the Trump presidency, I think it is forcing or leading Democrats to become a little bit more hawkish, and I think rightly so. For example, speaking, because Trump is so friendly to Putin, Democrats have become very strong on containing Russia, which I think is a good thing. But we'll see if that lasts past the Trump presidency.
Thank you. Assuming a post-Trump era, do you believe that we can resume or continue a leadership role in the world without the massive military that we've created, which is representing a very disproportionate part of our national resources? Can that be done without continuing to have the biggest military in the world? And what are the alternatives to continuing that?
Well, again, in the answer to this, I'm going to reveal to you why I'm not actually a Democrat, why I'm not a progressive, why I still remain on the center right, even though I can't stand the current Republican Party, because I do believe that we need to have American leadership, not only in the realm of ideas and championing freedom, but I think we also need to have American military leadership. I do think that we need to have the strongest military in the world, because I think our military is the greatest guarantee of international peace and stability, and it's not unaffordable given the fact that we are spending about 3.5% of GDP on defense, 3.5 cents on the dollar on defense, which is far, far lower than the amount that we spent during the Cold War. Now, in absolute terms, it's a lot of money. It's about $600 billion a year, something like that. But as a percentage of the economy, it remains very affordable. And I think, in fact, it's cheaper than the alternative, because we have seen in the past what happens if the international system becomes entirely lawless. If there is nobody to maintain peace and deterrence, then the likelihood of conflict rises exponentially. And whatever we're spending on the military now is going to seem like quite a bargain in terms of both treasure and lives compared to the cost of getting embroiled in a war, compared to the cost of actually pursuing an America First policy as we did in the 1930s and allowing predatory states like Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan to run roughshod over the international system. That is not something we can remain aloof from. Sooner or later, we're going to be drawn into a conflict if those kinds of forces are given free rein around the world. And I think one of the great things that the Greatest Generation did was to maintain our military commitments in both East Asia and in Europe. And of course, that was expanded in the 1970s and 80s to include the Middle East. And those are the three great economic centers of the world, right? Europe, Middle East, East Asia, the three great productive centers of the global economy. And we have a substantial military presence in all those places that essentially acts as a guarantor of stability, that deters conflict, maintains the peace, keeps sea lanes open, keeps commerce flowing, stops international aggression, as we did in the case of Kuwait in 1991. I think that is all very much to our benefit. That's not something that Donald Trump, I don't think, understands. But the prerequisite for doing that is to maintain this incredibly strong American military. Now, I will say that I think it becomes harder to do because we're not showing fiscal discipline in other areas. And I think, it's tragic how Republicans have turned their back on the whole idea of fiscal discipline. They're basically doubling the deficit. We're going to have trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. That is incredibly irresponsible because it makes it almost impossible for us to fight a future recession, but it's also incredibly irresponsible because the interest on the debt, as well as the spiraling cost of all these entitlement programs, is going to squeeze out all discretionary spending, including spending on the military. And so we will, unless we get our fiscal house in order, we will not be able to maintain our military strength in the future. And I think that will be a very dangerous thing if that comes to pass.
Thank you for answering my follow-up question.
Glad I could anticipate it.
Yes.
Oh, you just did.
Okay, good.
I'd like to ask you a question about China. Where do you think China's going? How much of a threat will it be? I realize that by Trump pulling us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he cut off what was a containment theory, a way of looking at the policy, and that I believe we have a lot of trouble facing us ahead with China, and not in many, many aspects: trade, population, military, intrigue, all kinds of things, and their ability to try to get control around the world. Could you please comment on that?
Well, I think we do need to be concerned about the rise of China, not because they're becoming rich and not because they have a trade surplus with us, which is what Donald Trump seems to be the most exercised about. I think we need to be concerned about China because it is this increasingly powerful nation where power is increasingly consolidated in one person, Xi Jinping, who has more authority than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And they are acting in increasingly aggressive fashion. For example, they have essentially annexed the South China Sea in violation of international court rulings. And the balance of power is shifting against us there, where you had the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command saying that we cannot essentially contest, China's hold on the South China Sea absent a war with China, which obviously nobody wants. But I mean, if China holds the South China Sea, they're basically holding hostage something like a third of global maritime commerce. So they have a hammerhold on the international economy. That's something we need to be concerned about. I think that Trump's priorities with China are backwards because, from my vantage point, we ought to be trading with China. There's nothing wrong with trading with China. Yes, we do need to be worried about intellectual property theft. We do need to be worried about cyber espionage. But according to our own government, those problems have been ameliorating to some extent. And we should certainly, but if we're going to deal with those problems, the way to deal with them is with our allies, with our trade partners, through the WTO, with the Europeans, with Japan, with other states working in concert. And the most effective way to do it is through the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, increasing American trade links with other countries in East Asia. And Trump is going in the exact opposite direction. He's launched this trade war with China, which I think makes no sense, and which I think you're seeing it now that they've hit China with about $250 billion worth of tariffs. You're now starting to see it affect the bottom line with all these companies reporting hits to earnings because of the cost of the tariffs, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. So instead of cutting off China and disrupting these global supply chains, I think we should keep trading. We should work with our allies to try to reduce their abuses of intellectual property, which again I think have actually been getting better over the years. And we should be trying to form an alliance with other states around China and basically make clear to them that if they will rise peacefully, trading and not engaging in military aggression, we have no problem with them becoming the largest economy. But the signal that Trump is now basically sending to China is we want to stop the rise of China. We don't want them to become the largest economy in the world, and that does not leave a lot of room for compromise. And so I think there are legitimate concerns about China, but I'm very worried that what Trump is doing is going to be counterproductive, and I'm really not sure what the off-ramp is from his trade war because I don't know what he wants. I don't think anybody actually knows what he wants. What is China going to do to satisfy him? I mean, if you listen to some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House, they want China to give up their Made in China 2025 program, which is their entire industrial economic game plan for Chinese, economic rise. They're not going to give that up. I mean, that would be tantamount to, abdicating their economic ambitions. That's not going to happen. You've got to have a realistic ask, and it's not clear what that is in Trump's case.
Yes, in the back. Yes. Do you next?
Our founding fathers decided that each of the small states should have 2 senators, and that we should have an electoral college. Now we have a situation where somebody who lives in California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, their vote doesn't mean as much as somebody who lives in South Dakota, North Dakota, Rhode Island. And as a result, the people in the small states control the election of somebody running for Supreme Court justice, such as Brett Kavanaugh. And there are a lot of people that are offended by that. Do you see any possible way, given our constitutional restrictions, that can ever change, that we can ever have something come about where the Electoral College is set aside and popular vote decides the presidency, and where the control of the small states, as far as the Senate is concerned, is cut down?
I mean, I agree with your diagnosis of the problem, and I think it is a serious issue because I think it is undercutting the legitimacy of our democracy because you do have essentially minority control of many of our institutions in Washington. but I don't know what the solution is. It's not obvious there is any solution because of the very way the Constitution was set up, because if you're going to amend the Constitution, you have to get the small states to agree, and why would they ever agree to give up their power? So, as I said before, we're screwed.
We have one question in the back, and after that, could we have another question from a woman? Get ready. Okay, go ahead.
So it turns out that, not that this is important, but you and I were at Berkeley at the same time, and I have to say that I'm a much bigger fan of your columns today than I was while we were in college. My question is, I'm wondering...
Well, I'm glad it wasn't the other way around, because it would be pretty pathetic if I were a much better and wiser columnist when I was 21 as opposed to when I'm 49.
Well, I think it just shows that we're all capable of evolved thinking. I wanted to kind of tap onto the gentleman's question who asked about the post-Trump world. And my question is the inverse. What if we don't make it to a post-Trump world because we're dealing with someone who does unprecedented things time and time again, and without sounding like an alarmist or someone who is outraged? Here's someone who undermines our most powerful institutions time and time again and questioned the potential outcome of the 2016 election, which he won. So if we're facing 2020, 2024, and he loses and decides not to leave, what happens at that point? And what are the institutions or individuals who are going to try to do something?
Well, I have a lot of concerns about Donald Trump, but that's not actually one of them. I mean, if he is voted out of office, I think he's going to leave office for, very simple realpolitik reasons, and it's not because he respects the democratic process. It's not because he's a gracious loser. It's for the very simple, realpolitik reason that he does not control the levers of power. He does. And to put this in brutal, in kind of the brutal way that we're used to thinking about politics in developing countries, he doesn't control the security forces. I mean, the U.S. Armed Forces are not going to rally to keep Donald Trump in office unconstitutionally. The Secret Service is not going to fight off anybody who tries to drag him out of the Oval Office. That is simply not going to happen. I mean, what I say in the book is I do think that Trump has pretty much the same personality type, temperament, and ideas as a lot of dictators. I mean, kind of garden variety dictators. I mean, he is not a Hitler. I mean, Hitler was uniquely evil. But I think he is similar in personality type to folks like, Mussolini, Perón, Chavez, kind of typical run-of-the-mill third world dictators. I mean, the difference, of course, is that he has not taken power in 1920s Italy or 1950s Argentina or 2000 Venezuela. He has taken power in one of the most durable constitutional republics in the world. We do have checks and balances. You see them operating with the courts, with the press, occasionally with Congress, too rarely, but even sometimes with Congress. And so, I think much as he would love to usurp power and declare himself president for life, it's just not in the cards. My concern is not that he's going to impose fascism or become a dictator for life or anything like that, but I do think that he will undermine American democracy. I think he's undermining it already. He is alienating his followers from the mainstream of American democracy and the kind of normal give and take that we have, and I think it will corrode undermine American democracy, but it's not going to collapse American democracy. You're not going to have an actual war to drag him out of the White House. That's the good news.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, this is the last question. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about the media for a second. I'm a fan of the media, that's not what I'm saying. But if you watch the liberal media, they speak about Trump 100% of the time. So other voices, even though they're speaking negatively about Trump, other voices are never being heard. So whatever, let's say, the Democrats' views are, I don't hear them on that, and I certainly wouldn't hear them on Fox either. So what do you think about this, the media as it's being played in the present?
It's a conundrum. I don't think there's any good answer. I think this is something that folks in the media wrestle with, and I mean, I'm in the media, I guess. It's not they, it's me. I mean, I do draw a paycheck from both the Washington Post and CNN, so this is a dilemma I am familiar with, and basically it comes down to the fact that, you know, Donald Trump does not have that many skills. He's not that smart. He certainly knows very little, but he is brilliant at marketing. He's a salesman of genius. He is a world-class demagogue, and the one thing that he knows how to do is how to dominate the news cycle, and he does it every single day by doing and saying crazy, off-the-wall stuff that forces you to pay attention. And the consequence of that is, as you say, even when we're criticizing him, we are inadvertently relaying his message. And I know this happens all the time. When I'm on the air, we're always putting up whatever crazy tweet Trump just put up minutes ago, and then we're attacking it, but nevertheless, we're putting it up. So we're getting his message out, and he's aware of that. He's not stupid. He, you know, played the media like a Stradivarius in 2016. Not that he knows what a Stradivarius is, but he nevertheless played the media like a Stradivarius because he understood how to make news and how to get the cameras on him literally all the time, and how to get his message across basically over the heads of the media, because everybody other than Fox News is attacking him, but it doesn't matter because he's figured out how to go over us and, you know, use media like Twitter and but also live TV coverage to speak to his base. You know, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, do you not cover stuff that the President of the United States is saying? I mean, I feel like we are compelled to cover it, right? And if we don't cover it, then we're allowing him to get his lies and misinformation out there without challenge. Now, even if you challenge it, he's still getting it out there, so you can't win. But, you know, I think that, you know, if there is a silver lining here, I mean, it's kind of a good news, bad news, glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation, because on the one hand, you can say, how can somebody this batshit crazy have the support of like 41% of the American public, 42, 43, wherever he is right now? That's mind-boggling, right? And there are many days when I think that. On the other hand, you look at the economy, which has been going great guns, at least up until now, and you have to think, if this were a normal president, he would have the support of about 60%. So the fact that he is so nuts and says so many crazy and offensive things every single day, it does cost them. It's not like it's ignored. It does cost them significant support. There are far more people who despise Donald Trump than who are passionately attached to him. I mean, there's a substantial number on both ends, but there's more who hate him than who love him. And, you know, objectively speaking, you could say, well, the economy, I mean, he always says this, right? Greatest economy ever, and yet he's not reaping the full political benefits of that. And I think a lot of that has to do with his over-the-top offensive rhetoric and his unhinged Twitter attacks and rallies and all the rest of it. Again, it rallies the base. There is no question he has a loyal following, probably about 30% of the population, super devoted to Trump, 40% who are supporting him at some level. But then that leaves everybody else who is not so enamored. And I think the fact that we are exposing his lies, we are exposing his abuses, it does matter. I mean, yeah, there's a portion of the population which is cut off from reality, but mercifully that is still a minority of the country. And the majority, I think, they do understand it. Now, whether that translates at the polls in a couple of weeks, I don't know, because a lot of that has to do with enthusiasm, voter turnout, and unfortunately, many of the people who are most opposed to him, the young people, the minorities, those are the people who are much less likely to turn out than kind of the grumpy old white people who are his base. So, you know, I don't know how it shakes out politically, but, you know, to answer your question, I'm just not sure what the media should be doing differently. I don't know that we can ignore what the President of the United States is saying and doing.
To end on a more optimistic note, why don't you give us
That
your
is a
pitch?
challenge these days.
Give us your pitch as we close for the Renew Democracy Initiative. And you can read more about this in the book, but tell us a little bit about what could be done that's forward-looking.
Well, the Renew Democracy Initiative is this very small NGO in which I'm involved, along with a bipartisan cast of people, including, Garry Kasparov, the former world chess champion and Russian dissident, is really the driving force behind it. But we have, an impressive group of people, including, Bret Stephens, Ann Applebaum, Philip Bobbitt, Larry Tribe, Richard North Patterson, and many others from both the left and the right who are involved in this group. And we've issued a manifesto, which you can see on the website for the Renew Democracy Initiative, and you're all welcome to sign it. There's a book that we released with essays by a distinguished group of thinkers, including an introduction from John Meacham. And there's going to be a conference, and there's going to be more activities planned. And it's not unique. There are other groups like this, but basically it's an attempt to rally the vital center, as Arthur Schlesinger called it, of the center left and the center right against the populist threat to democracy. And not just in this country, we also have a number of Europeans involved in this initiative, because this is really a global challenge. And all the countries of Europe are facing a similar threat. You're seeing it in Brazil right now. You're going to probably see a far-right populist elected as president of Brazil this weekend. You're seeing it in the Philippines. It's a global threat. So this is our very small attempt to rally leading thinkers and political figures like Jose Maria Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, and others, to try to kind of revitalize the center and to speak for our common democratic values. And in our manifesto, we actually do not mention the name Trump once, although he is obviously looming over the manifesto, but it's really an attempt to transcend the current political moment and to understand that our problems did not begin with Trump, and they're not going to end when Trump is gone. This has been in the making for a long time, and there is a populist threat from both ends. It's not just from the right, it's also folks on the left like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who are really threatening kind of the very foundation of modern Western liberal capitalistic democracy. And that's something that we've taken for granted, and we've kind of assumed that this is just the way life is, and it's not. It's under challenge. We've seen in places like Poland and Hungary and the Philippines and many other places that democracy is being rolled back, and we're seeing democracy under threat here. Just this week, we have this widespread terrorist campaign targeting former presidents, targeting CNN, targeting other opponents of Donald Trump. This is not normal, folks. This is a real threat to our democracy, and we need to take it seriously. And so RDI is our very small attempt to do this, to do something about it. And I hope that there will be others as well, because, again, I think we've just been very complacent about democracy, and we need to fight back to preserve what we have achieved.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for your insights. And thank you. And hopefully we can welcome you back to the Pacific Council in a couple of years, and we can be even more optimistic then.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.